The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into the long, winding saga of a place you've probably heard of. Maybe from high school history class, or from that one time you fell asleep halfway through Gladiator. Yes, it's the Roman Empire. Or, more specifically, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, which sounds very dramatic. But don't worry, it's not going to be dramatic here. Think of it more like drifting along a lazy river while emperors mismanage things and marble statues slowly gather pigeon droppings. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe put your phone on silent, unless you enjoy hearing it vibrate every 3 minutes. This is going to take a while, because Rome took a while. And frankly, Rome was exhausting. Now, if you ask any Roman, any Roman who's been dead for about 2,000 years, they'd probably tell you their city was founded by 2 twins raised by a wolf. Yes, a wolf, Romulus and Remus. The story is that these 2 baby boys were tossed into the river Tiber because, of course, their great-uncle wanted them dead, because in ancient history, if you weren't being killed by your own family before age 5, were you even royalty? But instead of drowning like normal infants, they were rescued by, apparently, a she-wolf, which is already a pretty bold claim. And then, as if that wasn't weird enough, they were later adopted by a shepherd and his wife, who raised them into manly wolf-fed heroes. And naturally, as soon as they were old enough, the brothers decided the most logical thing to do would be start a city. Because why get a regular job when you can invent Rome?
Of course, brothers don't usually get along, and these 2 didn't either. Romulus ended up killing Remus, because nothing says family bonding like fratricide. And so Romulus became the first king of Rome in 753 BCE, which is a very long time ago, like back when running water meant hoping the nearest stream wasn't full of dead fish. So Rome started off as a monarchy, which basically meant a guy with a crown making decisions while everyone else farmed, fought, or occasionally rebelled. After about 7 kings, several of whom had names that sound more like minor Pokemon, Rome collectively decided they'd had enough of kings, especially because the last one, Tarquin the Proud, was kind of a nightmare. His son did some very bad things, there was a revolt, and suddenly Rome decided, okay, no more kings. Let's invent something new. Let's call it a republic. And thus, in 509 BCE, the Roman Republic was born, which sounds lovely and democratic. In reality, it was basically a handful of wealthy families deciding everything while everyone else pretended to have a say. Classic politics. The Senate, which was just a group of elite old men, had all the real power. They wore fancy togas and argued a lot, which, honestly, is still the closest thing to politics we have today. But here's the thing about the Romans. They were ambitious, aggressively so. Within a couple of centuries, they're outconquering neighbors left and right. They started as just a scrappy little town in central Italy, but soon they controlled the whole peninsula, then Sicily, then Spain, then Greece. Basically, if Rome could see it, Rome wanted it.
And at the center of all this expansion were the legions, the Roman military machine. Picture thousands of soldiers in heavy armor, marching in perfect lines, carrying big shields and short stabbing swords. They were disciplined, brutal, and frankly, terrifying. Other armies were like, we'll fight with enthusiasm and maybe a goat for luck. Rome was like, we will destroy you systematically and then pave a road over your corpse. Now, the Republic had a problem. The more territory they conquered, the more chaos they created back home. Because running an empire with a government designed for one small city, not the easiest. Senators were corrupt, power-hungry, and constantly backstabbing each other. Which brings us to one of the most famous names in Roman history, Julius Caesar. Caesar was that guy who was good at everything and knew it. He was a brilliant general, conquering Gaul, that's basically modern France, while writing his own war memoirs. Yes, he wrote books about his own greatness while still fighting. Imagine live blogging your own victories while covered in blood. Very humble. Back in Rome, his popularity skyrocketed, which made the Senate nervous, because senators really hated when someone became too powerful. So when Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army in 49 BCE, it was basically the Roman way of saying, "Surprise, I'm starting a civil war." The war, of course, ended with Caesar in charge. He declared himself dictator for life, which is basically just king with extra steps. Naturally, the senators did not love this, so they stabbed him. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was killed by a group of senators, some of whom were his closest friends. It was Rome's most famous workplace backstabbing, literally. But killing Caesar didn't actually fix anything. It just plunged Rome into more chaos. Eventually, Caesar's heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, took over. He outmaneuvered everyone, beat his rivals, and in 27 BCE declared the Roman Republic officially dead. Rome was now an empire.
And Augustus, the first emperor, was annoyingly competent. He established a system that worked, more or less. He reformed the government, reorganized the military, and ushered in what's called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which lasted about 200 years. That's a long time for peace, especially considering Rome's favorite hobby was usually invade neighbors. During this golden age, Rome built roads, aqueducts, temples, and amphitheaters. They spread Roman law, Roman culture, and Roman bathrooms across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Basically, if you were alive in the 1st century CE and lived near Rome, you were probably either conquered by them, paying taxes to them, or complaining about them. Of course, Rome being Rome, things were never simple. After Augustus, emperors ranged from pretty good to, please, dear gods, why? Tiberius, Augustus's successor, was gloomy and paranoid. Caligula was, well, Caligula. He's remembered for being extravagant, cool, and possibly insane. This is the guy who supposedly made his horse a senator, which honestly might still be an improvement over some politicians. Then there was Nero. Nero, the emperor who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned. He probably didn't actually fiddle since fiddles were uninvented yet, but he definitely wasn't the world's most responsible leader. He loved theater, poetry, and executing people who annoyed him. Eventually, even the Senate was like, yeah, this guy has to go. So Nero killed himself in 68 CE, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," which is a very Nero thing to say. But here's the strange part. Despite the madness of individual emperors, the empire itself kept functioning. The bureaucracy, the legions, the governors, they all just kept grinding along. Rome was like one of those massive, creaky machines that somehow kept running even when someone poured wine into the gears.
Still, cracks were forming. The empire kept expanding, which meant more borders to defend, more restless provinces, and more money wasted on wars. By the 3rd century CE, things got messy. Very messy. Emperors came and went faster than you could keep track. There were civil wars, assassinations, invasions. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, which is basically shorthand for Rome completely lost the plot. At one point, there were literally 3 different Roman empires at the same time: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the original Roman Empire trying to hold it all together in the middle. Imagine 3 groups of people all claiming to be the real Rome. Exhausting. Somehow, Rome pulled itself back together under Emperor Diocletian in the late 200s. He was like, okay, this is too big for one person, let's have 4 emperors instead.
which sounds like group work at school. Spoiler, it didn't go well. But at least he tried. By the time Constantine came around in the early 300s, Rome was already changing. Constantine legalized Christianity, which was a pretty big shift considering earlier emperors had tried to throw Christians to lions. He also founded a new capital, Constantinople, in the east, which, fun fact, would eventually outlive Rome by about 1,000 years. The Western Empire, though, it was not looking good. Constant invasions by Germanic tribes, weak emperors, and endless corruption wore it down. By the 400s, Rome was basically limping along, and in 476 CE, the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, yes, named after the very first king, was deposed by a barbarian general. Rome had officially fallen. Well, sort of. The Eastern Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, carried on for another millennium. But the glory days of Rome, the legions, the Colosseum, the emperors with increasingly questionable hairstyles, those were gone.
And that, in very sleepy fashion, is the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Or at least, the broad strokes of it. Because we'll be here all night, and then some, digging into the details. Which, of course, is exactly what we're going to do next. So, let's float gently into some of Rome's most dysfunctional emperors. Because if you thought the empire itself was messy, wait until you hear about the people running it. Hey again, still awake? If so, that's surprising, because Roman politics is basically a lullaby of endless scheming old men in togas. But don't worry, we're moving on to something slightly more entertaining. The emperors themselves. Now, here's the thing. Rome had a lot of emperors. Some of them were decent. A few were even competent. But many were disasters. Glorious, train wreck-level disasters. Which is why we're here. Because nothing makes history cozier than listening to the misadventures of ancient men who desperately should not have been in charge of an empire. So, let's start with one of the earliest emperors who really set the tone for dysfunction, Tiberius. Tiberius was the adopted son of Augustus, which sounds nice until you realize Augustus basically forced him into marrying his daughter, Julia. She didn't like him, he didn't like her. It was all very awkward. Imagine the world's most uncomfortable family dinner, except it never ends. As emperor, Tiberius was complicated. He was capable, but also paranoid and gloomy. He didn't like being in Rome, so he eventually retreated to the island of Capri, where he spent the last decade of his reign hiding in his villa. Senators back in Rome complained, but Tiberius didn't care. He ruled by letters. Yes, the emperor of Rome was basically working from home. Remote emperoring. Very modern. Of course, rumors swirled about what Tiberius was doing on Capri. Ancient gossip claimed he indulged in every kind of vice imaginable. Whether that's true or just the ancient equivalent of clickbait is hard to say. But what mattered was that by the time Tiberius died, he wasn't exactly beloved. People even celebrated his death in the streets. Always a good sign.
After Tiberius came Caligula. Caligula. His real name was Gaius, but as a child, he wore tiny little soldier boots while accompanying his father on campaigns. Caligula means little boots, which is both adorable and humiliating. Imagine being the emperor of Rome, ruler of millions, and everyone just calls you Bootsy. Now, when Caligula first became emperor in 37 CE, people were thrilled. He was young, charismatic, and the grandson of Augustus. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. But then he fell seriously ill, and when he recovered, he was different. Like, really different. Caligula became notorious for extravagance and cruelty. He spent lavishly on games and buildings, bankrupted the treasury, and delighted in humiliating senators. He also allegedly tried to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul. Historians debate whether this was serious or just a joke. Either way, it says a lot about Roman politics that a horse was a genuine improvement over some senators. He was assassinated after only 4 years, and really, Rome was lucky it wasn't longer. Caligula is remembered as one of history's great examples of do not give absolute power to someone nicknamed Little Boots. Next up was Claudius. He wasn't supposed to be emperor. In fact, when Caligula was killed, soldiers found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Naturally, they dragged him out and declared him emperor, because nothing says perfect leadership material than a man literally cowering behind furniture. But Claudius surprised everyone. He was intelligent, interested in administration, and expanded the empire, most famously by invading Britain in 43 CE. The Romans weren't very impressed by Britain at first. Lots of fog, mud, and angry tribes with painted faces. But Claudius wanted a victory, and Britain became part of the empire. Still, his personal life was a mess. Claudius married multiple times, and his wives were, let's say, problematic. One of them, Messalina, was notorious for her scandals. Ancient sources claim she once competed in a who can sleep with more men in a single night contest, and apparently she won. Another wife, Agrippina the Younger, convinced Claudius to adopt her son, Nero. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Because then came Nero.
Nero became emperor at just 16, the youngest emperor Rome ever had at the time. At first, things seemed promising. He had good advisors, he listened to Seneca, the philosopher, but then Nero got bored of governing. He preferred acting, singing, and competing in athletic games, which would have been fine if you weren't supposed to be running an empire. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. 2/3 of the city burned down. People suspected Nero might have started it. He definitely used it as an excuse to build himself a massive golden palace. Not a good look. The story about him fiddling while Rome burned isn't true. Fiddles didn't exist. But the metaphor stuck. Nero's reign spiraled into chaos. He executed his own mother. He blamed Christians for the fire and had them brutally persecuted. Eventually, revolts broke out across the empire. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Facing certain death, Nero killed himself in 68 CE. His last words? "What an artist dies in me," which, honestly, is peak narcissism. After Nero, Rome went through what's called the Year of the Four Emperors, which, compared to what came before, is saying something. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. They weren't perfect, but they were competent, stable, and avoided turning the empire into a circus.
Trajan expanded Rome to its greatest size, conquering Dacia, modern-day Romania, which is why Romanians speak a Latin-based language today. Hadrian, instead of conquering, consolidated. He built Hadrian's Wall in Britain, basically saying, okay, that's far enough, no need to deal with angry Scots. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote Meditations, which people still read today for Stoic wisdom. Of course, Marcus also had a son, Commodus, and Commodus was not good. Commodus fancied himself a gladiator. Yes, the emperor of Rome liked to fight in the arena. He would dress up, grab weapons, and pretend to be Hercules. Which is fine as a hobby, less fine when you start bankrupting the empire for it. He renamed Rome after himself, renamed months after himself, and generally acted like the world's most spoiled child. Eventually, he was assassinated, because of course he was. And so, the empire stumbled on. Some emperors were okay, many were disasters. There were the soldier emperors who spent all their time fighting wars on the borders. There were the short-lived emperors who lasted only a few months before being killed by their own guards. Being emperor of Rome was less a job, more a death sentence. One emperor, Elagabalus, was a teenager obsessed with a sun god from Syria. He forced senators to watch bizarre religious ceremonies, married multiple times, including, according to some sources, a man, and shocked conservative Romans. He was eventually killed by his own guards because apparently Rome could handle decadence but not teenage awkwardness. Another, Caracalla, is remembered mainly for granting Roman citizenship to almost everyone in the empire, which sounds nice until you realize it was mostly so he could tax more people. He also murdered his brother Geta in front of their mother. Family dinners were not Rome's strong suit. And let's not forget Diocletian. He actually tried to fix things by dividing the empire into east and west with 4 emperors ruling together, the Tetrarchy, it was called. It worked for a little while until everyone started fighting again, but at least he tried. He also did something no emperor had done before. He retired. Yes, he just quit, moved to his villa to grow cabbages. Imagine being emperor of Rome and deciding vegetables were more fun. Honestly, respect. By the time Constantine took power, the empire was already changing fast. Constantine legalized Christianity, which was a big deal since Christians had gone from being persecuted to suddenly favored. He also founded a new capital, Constantinople, which would outlast Rome itself. But even Constantine couldn't save the western half of the empire. Constant invasions, economic troubles, and weak rulers dragged it down. And finally, in 476 CE, it all ended. Rome was gone. But here's the thing. The empire didn't collapse overnight. It took centuries of dysfunction, chaos, and emperors who probably should never have been in charge, which makes Rome's story oddly comforting. Because if they managed to keep things going for so long, maybe there's hope for us too. Now, let's drift even deeper into the decline, because if you thought bad emperors were fun, wait until you hear about how the empire actually fell apart. Welcome back. Or, if you nodded off during the last part and just woke up, welcome back anyway. Honestly, you didn't miss much. Just another parade of emperors making bad decisions and Rome pretending everything was fine. Because if the Roman Empire had a motto in its later centuries, it might as well have been, "We're still technically functioning. Don't ask how." So let's settle in for the real fun part, the decline, which, like most declines, wasn't fast or dramatic. It was long, drawn out, and full of awkward moments. Sort of like a dinner party that drags on for hours after the food is gone. Now, historians love to debate exactly when Rome began to fall. Some say the 3rd century crisis, when emperors were changing faster than modern prime ministers. Others point to the division of the empire under Diocletian. But really, it was a slow burn. And the truth is, Rome didn't so much fall as it sagged, like an old sofa that's been sat on too many times. Let's start with the 3rd century, often called the crisis of the empire. Around 235 CE, the Emperor Severus Alexander was killed by his own troops, which in Rome was less shocking than your neighbor forgetting to water their plants. After that, it was chaos. For about 50 years, Rome had dozens of emperors, many lasting less than a year. The empire split apart. There was the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyran Empire in the east, and the official Roman Empire in the middle, looking embarrassed, like a parent whose kids just started fighting in public. All this while, Rome was being invaded.
Goths, Vandals, Franks, Persians, basically anyone who could swing a sword wanted a piece of the empire. The frontiers were constantly under attack. Trade collapsed, the economy tanked, inflation got so bad that Roman coins were basically worthless. Imagine being paid in coins that were mostly cheap metal, while the emperor insisted they were still valuable. A very ancient version of printing money.
But Rome wasn't done yet. Along came Diocletian, one of the few emperors who actually tried to fix things. He reorganized the empire into the Tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. A power-sharing system, because if there's one thing Romans were great at, it was sharing. Just kidding, they were terrible at it. But Diocletian did manage to stabilize things for a while. He also cracked down on Christians, launching one of the harshest persecutions in Roman history, which, of course, backfired spectacularly. Within a century, Christianity would be the empire's dominant religion. Irony at its finest. Diocletian did something else unusual. He retired, voluntarily. He just walked away from being emperor and went to live on his estate, where he famously grew cabbages. Yes, cabbages. Imagine running half the known world and then saying, actually, I'd rather garden. Honestly, probably the most sensible decision any Roman emperor ever made. After him came Constantine the Great, who ruled from 306 to 337. Constantine is famous for 2 things: embracing Christianity and founding Constantinople. First, Christianity. For centuries, Christians had been persecuted, tortured, and occasionally turned into lion food for Roman entertainment. Constantine decided enough was enough. With the Edict of Milan in 313, he legalized Christianity, giving it protected status. He himself converted later, though how sincerely is still debated, but either way, Christianity went from outlawed cult to empire-wide religion, practically overnight. Second, Constantinople. Constantine realized that Rome itself was kind of a mess, politically, economically, and hygienically. So he built a shiny new capital in the east, on the site of the old Greek city Byzantium. He named it after himself, because humility was not really a Roman virtue. Constantinople was strategically located, rich, and defensible. Spoiler, it would last 1,000 years longer than Rome itself. After Constantine, things got messy again. His sons fought over the empire like kids fighting over toys. Civil wars broke out. Barbarian invasions increased. By the late 4th century, the writing was on the wall, literally sometimes, as angry tribes carved their victories into Roman stones. One of the biggest turning points came in 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople. The Emperor Valens faced off against the Goths. He didn't wait for reinforcements, charged in, and got himself killed along with most of his army. The Goths crushed Rome's forces. It was a shocking defeat, and it showed the empire was no longer invincible. The Romans had met their match and lost.
Meanwhile, the empire was splitting more and more between East and West. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, was stronger, better defended, wealthier, and more organized. The Western Empire, with Rome at its center, was not. The West was plagued by invasions, poverty, and weak leadership. Theodosius I, ruling in the late 4th century, was the last emperor to control both East and West. After his death, the empire was permanently divided. His 2 sons inherited the halves, and from then on, the Western Empire was basically on life support. Now let's talk about the barbarians. Not in the insulting sense, just in the Roman sense, meaning anyone who wasn't Roman. There were Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Saxons, and more, and they were increasingly powerful. Rome had once been able to crush them. Now, Rome was hiring them as mercenaries, paying them off, or desperately trying to keep them out. It was not a good look. Enter Alaric the Goth. In 410 CE, he and his troops marched into Italy and actually sacked the city of Rome. Yes, Rome itself.
The eternal city, the capital of the empire, was plundered. For Romans, this was unthinkable. They hadn't been invaded in 800 years. But here it was, the empire's weakness laid bare. Things didn't get better. In 445 CE, the Vandals sacked Rome again. The word vandalism comes from this event, which tells you all you need to know. And finally, in 476 CE, the Western Empire officially ended. A Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus. His name was a tragic irony. Romulus, after the first king of Rome, and Augustulus, a diminutive of Augustus, the first emperor. It was like naming him Little Rome Guy. He was barely a teenager, powerless and symbolic. With his fall, the Western Empire was gone. Of course, the Eastern Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, carried on for another 1,000 years. But that's another story. For the West, Rome had fallen. So why did Rome fall? Historians have argued about it for centuries. Some blame economic collapse, others blame military decline, some say political corruption, others say barbarian invasions. The truth is, it was all of the above. Rome was like an overstuffed cake, too big, too rich, too unstable. Eventually, it just collapsed under its own weight. And yet, Rome never truly disappeared. Its laws, its architecture, its culture, even its language, Latin, lived on. The Catholic Church carried Roman traditions. European kings styled themselves as new Caesars. The idea of Rome haunted history for centuries. In many ways, it still does. But in the end, the Western Roman Empire didn't fall in a single night. It took centuries of decline. Corrupt emperors, endless wars, economic woes, and the relentless pressure of new powers rising around it. It was not a good look. Now, as we close this chapter, maybe you're already halfway asleep, which honestly is the perfect tribute to the Romans, because if they were good at anything, it was dragging things out. Next, let's drift gently over to the Eastern Empire, the Byzantines, who somehow managed to cling to power for another 1,000 years, while still making all the same mistakes.